They told me it was just a formality, this whole exorcism business. A cleansing, the priest called it, something to rid me of the growing shadows that had taken root in my mind. For weeks they'd been talking about it, trying to convince me. I wasn't sure if I believed in demons or spirits, not really. But when the nights grew longer, the weight in my chest heavier, and the thoughts that slithered through my head like worms through rotten fruit, I knew something had to change. I wasn't always like this. I had a life once, a job, a family. But recently, things had started to go wrong. Terribly wrong. I found myself standing in rooms without remembering why. My hands would shake, sweat dripping from my palms, though I hadn't moved. And then there was the rage. It crept in like an unwelcome guest, slow at first, but growing in strength. It wasn't the normal frustration of a hard day, not the kind of anger you can shake off with a few deep breaths. This was something deeper, darker, like a storm brewing just beneath my skin, ready to tear its way out. I'd catch glimpses of it in the mirror sometimes, my face twisted, eyes wide and bloodshot, my lips drawn back in a sneer that wasn't mine. Not really. So when the priest, Father Martin, came to me that final night and said it was time, I agreed. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of desperation, or maybe because I knew deep down that I wasn't alone in my head anymore. The church was quiet when we arrived, far too quiet for a place like that. The kind of silence that presses in on you, making you feel like something is watching, waiting. The air was thick, heavy with incense, and the candles flickered in their sconces, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. Father Martin led me to the front of the altar, his voice low as he recited the prayers. I stood there shivering in the cold, damp air. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Not by Father Martin, no, but something else. Something far worse. The first hour passed uneventfully. The prayers, the incense, the soft hum of Latin words filling the air, it all felt like a strange ritual, distant, almost pointless. I was about to scoff, to tell the priest this was all ridiculous, when I felt it. A sudden weight slammed into my chest like a fist gripping my heart, squeezing tight. My knees buckled and I hit the floor, gasping for breath. Cold sweat dripped down my face as a low, guttural growl escaped my throat. But it wasn't my growl. The sound reverberated through the empty church, bouncing off the walls, and I saw Father Martin's eyes widen in alarm. That's when it started. The room twisted, the shadows on the walls bending and curling in ways that defied logic. The candles flickered, then sputtered out all at once, plunging us into near darkness. But even in the dim light, I could see it. A figure standing just beyond the altar, its face obscured, its body tall and twisted, like something pulled from a nightmare. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The figure moved closer, its steps slow, deliberate. The air grew colder, freezing, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The sound of footsteps echoed through the church, though the figure's feet never touched the ground. Father Martin's voice cracked as he continued the exorcism, his words now frantic, desperate. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at the thing approaching me, its face now visible. And oh God, the face. It was her, the face of my wife. Twisted, pale, eyes wide and bloodshot, staring right at me. But it wasn't her. Not really. Her lips curled into a smile, a cruel, mocking grin that sent a chill down my spine. "You did this," the thing whispered, its voice like nails scraping against glass. I shook my head, trying to scream, to move, to fight. But I couldn't. The weight on my chest grew heavier, pressing me down, suffocating me. My vision blurred, dark spots dancing in front of my eyes. "You killed her," it hissed, leaning closer, its cold breath brushing against my ear. "No," I managed to croak, my voice barely audible. But deep down, I knew the truth. A memory, faint but growing clearer by the second, of that night, of the argument, of the knife in my hand. The figure reached out, its hand cold as ice, brushing against my cheek. I flinched, but it held me there, its grip like iron. "You let me in," it said, its voice now eerily calm. "And now, you can't get rid of me." Father Martin's voice broke through the haze, louder now, commanding. The figure recoiled, hissing, retreating back into the shadows. I gasped for air, my heart pounding in my chest. But the relief was short-lived. Behind me, I heard the sound of something heavy scraping across the stone floor. Slowly I turned, my body stiff with terror. The doors of the church were closing, the heavy wooden beams sliding into place with a deafening thud. We were trapped, and somewhere in the darkness, I heard the faint sound of footsteps, getting closer. The footsteps echoed in the hollow silence of the church, each step heavier than the last. My heart pounded in my chest so loud it almost drowned out the sound. Almost. I dared not turn around. Father Martin had gone silent behind me, the murmurs of his prayers swallowed by the thick, unnatural quiet that had settled over the room. The air was so cold now I could see my breath clouding before me, dissipating into the dark like the last remnants of hope. There was something in here with us, something that didn't belong. I felt its presence before I saw it, like a weight pressing down on my shoulders, an oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. My legs trembled, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to run. A voice, soft, distant, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Michael." It was her voice again, my wife's, but it wasn't right. It was distorted, like the crackle of a radio station just out of tune, warping with each passing second. "Come to me." I blinked, and in that split second the room shifted. The pews seemed to stretch and distort, twisting in ways that defied all logic. The candles flickered back to life, but their flames were dim, casting grotesque shadows that danced along the walls. My pulse quickened as I heard it again, those footsteps closer now. "Father," I whispered, my voice barely a croak. "What's happening?" No answer. I glanced over my shoulder. Father Martin stood there, frozen, his lips still moving, though no sound came out. His eyes were wide, locked on something just beyond me, something in the shadows. I wanted to tell him to run, to scream for help. But when I turned fully to face him, my stomach twisted into a knot of icy dread. He was staring at the altar. And there, behind the pulpit, something moved. It was just a shape at first, indistinct and shrouded in the dark, but as it stepped forward into the weak candlelight, I saw it. The thing that had taken the shape of my wife's face was back, but now it had changed. Twisted. Her eyes, once soft and familiar, were nothing more than hollow pits of darkness. Her skin, once warm and alive, had turned gray and withered, clinging to bone like parchment. And her mouth, oh God, her mouth, it stretched wide, too wide, as though her jaw had been unhinged, a grotesque smile carved into her face. I staggered back, my legs giving way as I crashed into one of the pews. My hands gripped the cold wood, trying to ground myself in some kind of reality. But there was no reality here. Not anymore. The thing took another step forward, its feet scraping across the stone floor, a sickening, slithering sound like nails dragging through wet earth. It raised one skeletal hand, pointing at me, its head cocked to the side like a broken doll. "You can't hide," it whispered, its voice slithering into my ears like poison. "You killed me. You can't run from that." "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "It wasn't me, it wasn't—" But the memory flashed again. The knife. The blood. Her screams. I tried to push it away, tried to block it out, but the harder I fought, the clearer it became. My hands slick with blood. Her body crumpled on the floor, eyes wide with terror. The room spun. The walls seemed to close in on me, warping, distorting. I felt my breath quicken, panic clawing its way up my throat. I looked to Father Martin for help, but he was gone, no longer standing at the altar. His robes lay in a crumpled heap on the ground, as if he'd been swallowed whole by the darkness. And then the sound. A low, guttural growl from behind me. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head, my breath hitching in my throat. The shadows in the corner of the room shifted, writhing like they were alive. And from within them, something emerged. A figure. Tall, hunched, its limbs too long, its face hidden behind a mass of tangled hair and shadow. But I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. It moved, crawling on all fours like some grotesque animal, its joints cracking with each movement. My heart slammed in my chest and I scrambled backward, desperate to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. But no matter how fast I moved, it was faster. It crawled closer, its breath hot against my skin, its body jerking and twisting in unnatural ways. I could feel it looming over me now, its presence suffocating, as though the very air had thickened around me. And then it spoke. Not in words. No, not like that. In my mind. "You brought me here, Michael. You let me in." My body convulsed, my skin burning as if every nerve was on fire. I clutched my head, trying to push the voice out, but it only grew louder, more insistent. "You're mine now, and you'll never be free." I wanted to scream, to fight, but I could feel it, Whatever it was, slithering inside my mind, coiling around my thoughts like a snake. It was taking control, pulling me deeper into the dark. And just before the world went black, I saw it. A face in the shadows. My face. But twisted, grinning. And I realized the terrible truth. I wasn't running from the darkness. I was the darkness. The door to my soul had been opened long ago. I just hadn't noticed until now. And there was no escape. The darkness wasn't just around me anymore. It was me. I could feel it crawling beneath my skin, slithering through my veins like a parasite, feeding off every ounce of fear that coursed through me. There was no distinction between where the horror ended and I began. I had become part of it, trapped in a nightmarish spiral that I couldn't claw my way out of. When I woke, or maybe I never truly slept, I was back in my house. But something was wrong. The walls seemed to breathe, the paint cracking like dried skin as if the house itself was decaying, dying. The shadows here were different too. They shifted unnaturally, bending and curling in ways that defied physics. There was a constant sound like whispering, but I couldn't make out any of the words. It was maddening. My hands trembled as I looked around. The room was my living room, but it wasn't. Everything felt off, wrong, like looking at a reflection in a warped mirror. The furniture was there, but it seemed stretched, warped, like something had twisted reality itself. The smell hit me next. A thick, putrid stench of rot and decay filling my nostrils, making me gag. I followed the smell, heart pounding, my pulse loud in my ears. I wasn't sure why I moved forward. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was something deeper, something darker, pulling me along like a puppet on strings. I reached the kitchen. There, lying in the middle of the floor, was my wife's body. Her eyes were wide open, staring up at me, but they were wrong. There was no life in them, no spark. Just empty, glassy orbs that seemed to see nothing, yet saw everything. Blood had pooled around her, soaking into the tiles, but it wasn't red anymore. It was black, thick and viscous, like tar. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The smell, that horrid, putrefied smell, was worse now, choking the air. And then she moved. Her body twitched, fingers curling unnaturally, bones cracking as she slowly, painfully, dragged herself toward me. Her mouth opened, not to scream, but to smile. That same grotesque, too wide smile I had seen in the church. "You did this," her voice rasped, low and guttural, as though it came from deep within the earth. "You can't hide from me, from what you are." I stumbled back, shaking my head. No, it wasn't me!" But the memory was there, clear and vivid now, seared into my mind. The fight, the rage, the knife in my hand, her blood on my skin. I fell to the floor, hands gripping my head as I tried to force the memory out, but it wouldn't leave. It clung to me like the darkness, like the smell of death that now filled every corner of the house. I felt something cold and wet touch my leg, and I looked down to see her fingers, black with decay, wrapping around my ankle. "It's your fault," she hissed, her voice echoing in my skull. "You let me die!" I screamed, kicking at her, scrambling backward until I hit the wall. But no matter how hard I kicked, no matter how much I fought, she kept coming. "You can't escape me, Michael," she whispered, her body rising from the floor now, bones cracking, joints popping in ways that shouldn't be possible. "We're bound together. Forever." Suddenly, the walls around me began to melt, literally melt, the paint peeling away in long, sickening strips, revealing nothing but blackness beneath. The floor shifted, groaning as it turned soft, sinking under my weight. I was trapped, sinking into the house itself, the walls closing in on me. And then, just when I thought the world couldn't twist any further into madness, I saw him, standing in the doorway. It was me, but not quite. The figure was taller, its skin pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, my eyes, were hollow. Dark pits where there should have been pupils, staring at me with a kind of sick amusement. It grinned, that same wide, unnatural grin my wife wore in her death. "You're finally starting to understand," it said, its voice eerily calm. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You're not real. You're not me." It stepped closer, the air around it warping with each movement, distorting reality as though it bent the very fabric of space. "I am you," it whispered, leaning down, its face inches from mine. "I've always been you." I pushed myself up, trying to run, but the figure grabbed me by the throat, its grip ice cold, stronger than anything human. It lifted me off the ground with ease, and I kicked, clawed, but it was no use. The house around us crumbled, pieces of the ceiling falling, the walls twisting into grotesque shapes. I could hear the low hum of the whispering voices again, louder now, almost deafening. As the figure's grip tightened, choking the life out of me, I realized what was happening. This wasn't an exorcism. This was a possession. I hadn't been fighting to rid myself of something dark. I had been fighting myself. The demon hadn't entered me. It had always been inside me, and now it was taking over. The figure released me, letting me drop to the floor, gasping for breath. I looked up, but it was gone. The room had returned to its warped, decaying state, but the figure, my twisted doppelganger, was nowhere to be seen. I was alone. Except I wasn't. I could feel it now, deeper than before. That presence inside me, stronger, more powerful, taking control. My limbs moved, but they weren't mine to command. My thoughts twisted, bending to its will. And in that moment I realized the horrifying truth. I had lost. The demon was me. And there was nothing left to fight. The days after that night blurred together, lost in a haze of fear and confusion. My mind felt fractured, splintered between reality and the nightmare that had overtaken my life. I stopped sleeping. How could I sleep when every corner of the house whispered my name? The shadows had grown longer, darker, more alive, creeping up the walls like they were waiting for something, waiting for me. I was no longer sure where I ended and the thing inside me began. It happened again late one night. I woke in the living room, though I didn't remember falling asleep. The house was quiet, too quiet, like the air itself had been sucked out. I stood, feeling unsteady on my feet, and noticed the door to the basement was open. That door hadn't been open in years. We never went down there after she died. A voice, low and familiar, whispered from the darkness beyond the door. My wife's voice. "Michael, come down, you need to see." My heart pounded, but my feet moved on their own, drawn to the door like a moth to a flame. The air grew colder as I descended the steps, each one creaking under my weight. The basement smelled damp, like something had been rotting down here for years. When I reached the bottom, I froze. There, lying in the middle of the floor, was her body. My wife. Exactly as I had seen her that night. The night I killed her. But this time, something was different. She wasn't decayed. She wasn't twisted or grotesque. She looked peaceful, as though she was simply sleeping. Her hands were folded over her chest, and her face was just as I remembered, soft, gentle, even in death. "Why are you doing this to me?" I whispered, choking on the words. "You know why," came a voice from the shadows. It wasn't hers this time. It was mine. I turned slowly, dread creeping up my spine, and there he was. The doppelganger. My twisted reflection. His eyes, those hollow black pits, stared into mine, his grin wide and mocking. "You've always known," he said, stepping closer. "You let me in long before the night she died. I was always here, waiting, feeding off every dark thought, every moment of weakness." I shook my head. No, that's not true. It wasn't me. I didn't—" "Oh, but you did," he hissed, his voice sharp as a blade. "You wanted her gone. You hated her. The fights, the resentment. You let me kill her because deep down you wanted it. And now you're trying to hide from it. Trying to blame me, but there's no one else to blame, Michael. It's just you." I backed away, my legs weak, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "You're lying. You're not real." He laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the basement. "I'm as real as you are. We're the same, you and I. Two sides of the same coin. But now, you've run out of excuses. It's time to face the truth." I stumbled back, my hand brushing against something cold and hard. I looked down and saw the knife. The one I had used that night. I stared at it, my hand trembling as I reached for it. "You remember, don't you?" the doppelganger whispered, his voice now soft, almost soothing. "How it felt in your hand, the weight of it, the way her blood felt so warm. How alive you felt in that moment." My fingers closed around the handle, the cold steel sending a shiver through me. The memory hit me like a punch to the gut. The rage, the blood, the way she had screamed my name, begging me to stop. But I hadn't. And then it all became clear. The doppelganger wasn't something that had invaded me. It wasn't a demon or a possession. It was me. Every dark thought I had ever pushed down, Every impulse I had buried had manifested in this thing. I had created him. I had let him take control because I didn't want to face the truth about what I had done. I had killed her. And I had wanted to. I gripped the knife tighter, my knuckles white. The doppelganger stepped closer, his grin growing wider, his eyes locked on mine. "There's only one way to end this," he whispered, his voice barely audible now. "You know what you have to do." I looked at him, then back at the knife. My hand shook, and for a moment I thought about plunging it into him, ending it all. But I knew that wouldn't work. He wasn't separate from me. He was me. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs, and raised the knife to my own throat. The doppelganger's grin faltered, just for a second, his eyes narrowing. "You don't have the guts," he sneered. "You'll never be free." But I didn't listen to him anymore. His voice was just an echo, something far away. I could feel the weight of the knife, feel the sharpness of the blade against my skin. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was in control. I didn't flinch. I didn't hesitate. And as the blade cut deep, the last thing I saw was his face, my face, twisting in horror, the grin vanishing, replaced by something I hadn't seen before, fear. The last thing I felt was relief, not from the pain, but from him. And in that final moment I knew I was free.